1100 hours, ship's clock. And I logged the same line I had logged every watch for 6 years. Band clear, no traffic, patrol nominal. Nobody on the long watch had ever gotten a different answer. The threshold accord had lapsed 118 years before I was born, back when Earth and the Veyron Concord still shared a border and still bothered to guard it together. Somewhere in that old arrangement, a joint monitoring post had been stood up on a stretch of dead frequency nobody used anymore. And somewhere in the Accord's collapse, the order to shut that post down had simply never been written. So the post kept running. 4 generations of crews had rotated through the long watch, listening to a band the Concord itself had forgotten existed, because the treaty that created it was older than either government currently in charge of caring. I was the 5th generation, and I did not expect that to change. The hail came in at 1140, buried under so much decay and static that our system almost logged it as background noise. It wasn't shaped like a call to us. It had a Concord military header, a Garrison designation, and a routing string aimed at a fleet base 4 sectors away. A fleet base that, as far as our records showed, still existed and still answered its own mail. This signal wasn't supposed to touch the long watch at all. It had been fired down a relay chain that, unknown to whoever sent it, still had one dead branch open, ours, left wired into the network from the Accord days and never pruned. I ran it twice before I believed it. A border garrison, designation Kells Furrow, requesting immediate reinforcement against a raiding force it could not hold against. Casualties climbing, no response from its own chain of command in the time since the call went out. The timestamp was 6 hours old. Captain Aldous read it over my shoulder without saying anything for a long moment. Then he said what I already knew he'd say. "That's not addressed to us." "No, sir." "Nobody's expecting us." "No, sir." He looked at the plot, at the 4 days it would take the long watch running hard to reach Kells Furrow, and at the 6 hours already spent. He asked me to confirm the routing header 3 times, not because he doubted my reading, but because he wanted to be sure, before he committed a 118-year-old ship to someone else's war, that the mistake was real, and not something our own aging systems had manufactured out of static. It was real. Then he gave the order to come about, and I logged that too, because logging things was still the job, even the things nobody had planned for. The 4 days out were the longest of my service. We ran the long watch harder than her maintenance logs recommended, and twice Chief Amati came up from engineering to report numbers he didn't like on the drive coils, and twice Aldous told him to keep them running anyway. Nobody aboard said much about where we were going or why. There wasn't a version of the conversation that didn't end with someone pointing out that Kells Furrow had never once, in 118 years, sent so much as a maintenance ping down our side of that frequency. We were not owed this. We went anyway. We arrived on the 5th day to a garrison still standing, which surprised all of us more than it should have. Kells Furrow was a mining perimeter, not a fortress. 6 defense platforms, and a shield generator built to stop smugglers, not an organized raiding force with armor plating and jamming. They had held 4 days past when they should have broken, on discipline and stubbornness and nothing else, because the fleet that was supposed to relieve them had never gotten the call. The long watch is a Corvette, one hull, aging, armed for patrol duty and treaty enforcement, not for relief operations. We were not what Kells Furrow needed. We were what showed up. I stood behind Captain Aldous on the bridge when we opened the channel, and I watched a man I did not know go very still. Commander Dorith had the look of someone who had stopped sleeping 4 days ago and hadn't noticed yet. He answered the hail with the flat, exhausted courtesy of someone expecting bad news delivered kindly. An evacuation order, maybe, or confirmation that no help was coming, and he should start preparing his people for that. What he got instead was an Earth Patrol officer telling him they had a firing solution on the raiding force's lead elements and were inbound to engage. He didn't say anything for 11 full seconds. I counted them, because counting things was easier than watching his face work through what he was hearing. "You are not on our response roster," he said finally. Not hostile, not grateful, just stating a fact he needed stated out loud so it would hold still. "No, Commander," Aldous said. "We're not." "Then how are you here?" "Your relay routed through a station on our patrol grid. We've been on that grid since before the Accord lapsed. Nobody told us to stop listening." Dorith looked at that the way a man looks at a bill he doesn't remember incurring, The accord ended before I was commissioned. It did on our side too. He didn't ask the question sitting behind that exchange. Why does an obsolete treaty still have a ship attached to it? Because there wasn't time, and because I don't think the answer would have made him feel any better. 118 years of institutional forgetting, on both sides, and the only reason Kells Furrow had backup at all was that nobody, in more than a century, had ever gotten around to canceling a piece of paper. The engagement itself is not the part of this worth dwelling on. One Corvette against a raiding force that had already spent 4 days grinding on shield generators is not an even fight in either direction, and I won't pretend the Long Watch turned the tide alone. What we had that Kells Furrow didn't was a working weapons array and 4 days less fatigue, and that was enough to break the Raiders' formation long enough for the Garrison's own platforms to finish the job. It took under 2 hours. Nobody on our side or theirs would call it decisive. It was just enough, arriving exactly as late as it did, which was very late and also, somehow, in time. I spent most of those 2 hours at the comms station, feeding targeting corrections down to the platform crews on a channel that hadn't existed until we opened it that morning. Halfway through, a young voice on the Garrison side asked who exactly we were, since our transponder tag didn't match anything in their registry. Nobody answered him. There wasn't time, and there wasn't a short version. Afterward, Dorothy requested to come aboard, which surprised Aldous more than the fight had. He stood on our bridge, smaller than his own command deck, older, everything about it built for a war that had ended before either of us was serving, and he looked at the old monitoring console I'd logged 1,100 hours on, still labeled in a script half his people didn't use anymore. "You have been listening to that frequency the entire time," he said. "Not a question. Every watch, every day." Why? I answered that one. Because Aldous let me. Because nobody told us the reason to stop was a good one. He studied the console a while longer, and I want to say his face did something dramatic, some recognizable turn from disbelief into gratitude, but it didn't. What crossed it instead was quieter than that. The look of a man doing arithmetic he'd rather not finish, working out how many other dead frequencies might still have someone on the other end, and how much of what his own people called silence was really just a channel nobody had checked in a long time. "I will be filing a report," he said, recommending that frequency be reactivated on our end. "We'll leave it running either way, Commander." He didn't thank us. I don't think that's a criticism of him. Gratitude would have made it a simpler story than it was, and both of us knew it wasn't simple. It was an accident of bureaucracy that happened to save his garrison, and there was nothing to be done with that except log it and move on, which is what we did. Before he left, he asked to see the accord itself, the actual treaty text, if we still carried a copy. We did, buried 3 folders deep in an archive nobody browsed. He read it standing at my console, not saying anything, and when he finished, he asked one more question, quieter than the others. How many other posts like ours might still be running on his side of the old border, listening to bands his people had long since stopped checking? I told him I didn't know. Neither did Aldous. Neither, I suspected, did anyone currently serving in either government. The Long Watch pulled out 2 days later, back onto the loop, back onto the frequency, and I logged the departure the same way I logged everything else. I don't know if the Concord ever reactivated their side of that old relay. I like to think Dorothy's report went somewhere, and did something, but reports like that have a way of settling into drawers, the same way ours did for 118 years. What I know is this. Somewhere out past a border 2 governments stopped guarding together a long time ago. There is still a dead frequency with a live ship listening on it, standing a watch that was never formally ordered to end. Nobody's expecting an answer from us. That was never really the point. We keep listening anyway,